I discovered my poor janitor father was actually a millionaire. When his new wife tried to cut me out, I made one move she never saw coming. The day I walked into the lawyer's office, I thought I was saying goodbye to my poor janitor dad's broom closet savings. Instead, I learned he was secretly a millionaire, and his new wife wanted every penny for herself. My name is Hannah Carter, and I'm 25 years old. This is the story of how I discovered everything I knew about my father was a lie, and how I fought the greediest woman alive to claim what was rightfully mine. I always thought my dad, Michael Carter, was just a simple janitor who worked night shifts to keep food on the table. He wore old work boots that were held together with duct tape, carried his lunch in a wrinkled paper bag, and never spent a dime on himself. When I was growing up, we shopped at thrift stores and ate mac and cheese 3 nights a week. But at his funeral last month, everything I believed about him began to unravel. The service was small, just me, a few co-workers from the school where he cleaned, and Victoria, the woman he'd married just 1 year ago. Victoria sat in the front row wearing designer sunglasses and a black dress that probably cost more than my rent. Something about her didn't sit right with me, but I was too heartbroken to care. As his only daughter, I expected to inherit little more than some old tools and maybe his beat-up pickup truck. Dad had always told me he was just getting by, and I believed him. We'd never had money growing up, and after Mom died when I was 12, it was just the two of us scraping together every dollar. But 3 days after the funeral, Dad's lawyer called me with a tone I'd never heard before. "Miss Carter, I need you to come in for some urgent estate matters," Mr. Peterson said. "There are complications we need to discuss immediately." The way he said complications sent chills down my spine. What could be complicated about inheriting a janitor's modest belongings? I drove to his office in downtown, my stomach churning with anxiety. The building was fancy, all marble floors and mahogany paneling. I felt underdressed in my jeans and cardigan, wondering why Dad had used such an expensive lawyer. When I walked into the waiting room, I got my first shock. Victoria was already there, sitting perfectly poised in a leather chair, checking her manicured nails. She looked up at me with barely concealed irritation. "Hannah," she said with fake sweetness. "I was wondering when you'd show up." We were called into Mr. Peterson's office together, which felt wrong somehow. Victoria sat across from me, her designer purse placed deliberately on the desk like she owned the place. I clutched my worn backpack, feeling more out of place by the minute. Mr. Peterson was a distinguished man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked uncomfortable as he shuffled through a thick file. "Ladies, what I'm about to tell you may come as quite a shock," he began, his voice careful and measured. Victoria leaned forward slightly, and I noticed her perfectly applied lipstick curve into what looked almost like a smirk. "Your father, Miss Carter, left behind considerably more than you might expect," Mr. Peterson continued. He slid a manila folder across the mahogany desk toward me. "Perhaps you should see for yourself." My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were documents I couldn't immediately understand, stock certificates, property deeds, and bank statements with numbers that made my eyes widen. Victoria's smirk grew wider, as if she knew something I didn't. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and delivered the words that would change everything. "Your father secretly amassed an estate worth $4.7 million. I stared at the papers, convinced there had been some mistake. The bank statements showed account after account, each containing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Property deeds for rental houses I'd never heard of. Stock portfolios that had been carefully managed for decades. "This can't be right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My dad was a janitor. We were poor. We lived paycheck to paycheck. Mr. Peterson nodded sympathetically. "Your father was indeed a janitor, but he was also one of the most financially savvy men I've ever known. He lived modestly by choice, investing every spare dollar while maintaining the appearance of having very little. Victoria finally spoke, her voice dripping with false concern. It must be so overwhelming, dear. All that money, all that responsibility. I can't imagine how you must feel. But there was something in her tone, a smugness that made my stomach turn. She didn't sound surprised by any of this. She sounded like she'd been expecting it. Mr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There is, however, a complication with the inheritance. Victoria's eyes lit up, and I felt my world begin to tilt. What kind of complication? The lawyer pulled out another document, this one bearing my father's distinctive handwriting. Your father included what's called a character clause in his will. Mr. Peterson read the clause aloud, his voice steady but grave. My daughter Hannah will inherit my entire estate only if she can prove, through her actions during the probate period, that she values integrity over money and understands the true meaning of wealth. I felt like the air had been sucked from the room. What does that mean exactly? It means, Victoria said, her mask of sympathy finally slipping, that if you fail your daddy's little test, the entire estate goes to his surviving spouse. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at herself. Me. The lawyer nodded reluctantly. I'm afraid that's correct. Mr. Carter was very specific about this. He wanted to ensure his wealth went to someone who would honor his values. Judge Morrison will evaluate your conduct during the 60-day probate period. Victoria leaned back in her chair, looking like the cat who had already eaten the canary. I have to say, Hannah, it sounds like your father wasn't entirely sure he could trust you with his money. How heartbreaking that must be. My hands clenched into fists under the table. The way she said it, so condescending and cruel, made my blood boil. Whatever this test was, I had to pass it. Not just for the money, but to prove that I was the daughter my father believed I could be. But looking at Victoria's confident smirk, I realized she was already planning to make sure I failed. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Mr. Peterson explained that I had 60 days to prove my character, though he was frustratingly vague about what exactly that meant. Victoria asked pointed questions about the timeline and seemed to know more about the legal process than someone should who'd only been married to my father for a year. As we left the office, she caught up with me in the parking lot. Hannah, sweetie, she called out, her heels clicking on the asphalt. I hope there are no hard feelings about all this. Your father and I discussed his concerns about you many times. I spun around to face her. What concerns? Victoria's smile was ice cold. Well, your spending habits, for one. He worried you'd blow through his life's work in a matter of months. All those student loans, your little shopping trips, that expensive apartment you can barely afford. Each word felt like a slap. My apartment costs $600 a month, and I haven't been shopping for anything but groceries in 6 months. Oh honey, Victoria said, touching my arm with false compassion. Sometimes people see us differently than we see ourselves. Your father loved you, but he wasn't blind to your flaws. She walked away, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot, shaking with rage and confusion. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment trying to process everything that had happened. $4.7 million. My father, who I thought could barely afford his medication, had been secretly wealthy all along. And now his new wife, a woman he'd known for barely 2 years, was positioned to take everything if I somehow failed a test I didn't understand. I was going through Dad's personal effects when I found an envelope with my name on it, written in his familiar handwriting. It had been tucked inside his old Bible, the one he read every morning with his coffee. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with one sentence: find the key to who I was, and you'll find the truth. Below that, he'd drawn a simple sketch of an old-fashioned key, and at the bottom, he'd written, "The janitor's closet holds more than cleaning supplies." My heart pounded as I stared at the cryptic message. What key? What truth? And why did everything have to be a riddle? I thought about Dad's job at Roosevelt Elementary School, where he'd worked the night shift for 15 years. I'd visited him there a few times when I was younger, watching him methodically clean each classroom with a pride that seemed too big for such a simple job. Maybe the answer was there, in that janitor's closet he'd mentioned. The next morning, I drove to Roosevelt Elementary and convinced the day janitor to let me into Dad's old storage room. It was exactly as I remembered, shelves lined with cleaning supplies, a small desk covered in work schedules, and Dad's battered toolbox sitting in the corner. I searched through everything, looking for anything that might be the key Dad had mentioned. Behind bottles of floor cleaner and boxes of trash bags, I found a small metal lockbox I'd never noticed before. The box was about the size of a shoebox, painted forest green with scratches that showed its age. There was no key, and the lock looked solid. But carved into the top, in Dad's handwriting, was a single word, trust. I shook the box gently. Something rattled inside, papers, maybe, or small objects. Whatever was in there, Dad had thought it was important enough to hide. The day janitor, Mr. Williams, watched me from the doorway. "Your daddy was a good man," he said quietly. "Worked harder than anyone I ever knew, but he was always thinking about something bigger than just mopping floors." "What do you mean, Mr.?" Williams smiled sadly. "He used to say that the real cleaning happened in here." He tapped his chest, "not out there in the hallways." Said his job wasn't just about keeping the school clean, it was about keeping his soul clean too. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out how to open the lockbox without destroying whatever was inside. Every locksmith I called wanted more money than I could afford, and I was starting to feel desperate when my phone rang. "Hannah? This is Victoria. I was hoping we could have lunch today. I feel like we got off on the wrong foot yesterday." Her sudden friendliness felt suspicious, but I agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown. Maybe if I could understand her better, I could figure out what she was planning. Victoria was already seated when I arrived, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my car. She'd ordered for both of us, expensive salads that I would never have chosen. "I've been thinking about your father's test," she said, cutting into her salmon with precise movements. "It's really quite unfair, don't you think? All that pressure on you to prove yourself worthy." I picked at my salad, waiting for her real agenda to reveal itself. "Did you know," Victoria continued casually, "that your father used to be business partners with a very wealthy man? Charles Whitman, maybe you've heard of him? Whitman Industries?" I hadn't, but I tried not to show my surprise. Victoria smiled, clearly enjoying having information I lacked. "Oh yes, they were quite close at one time. Too bad your father lost it all in some bad investments. Could have been rich decades ago." After lunch, I couldn't stop thinking about what Victoria had said. Charles Whitman wasn't a name I recognized, but Whitman Industries was huge. I'd seen their logo on construction sites all over the city. I found the company's headquarters online and drove there that afternoon, not sure what I was looking for but feeling like I had to follow every lead. The receptionist was polite but firm. "Mr. Whitman didn't see people without appointments. Could you tell him I'm Michael Carter's daughter?" I asked, feeling foolish. Her expression changed immediately. She made a quick phone call, then escorted me to the top floor. Charles Whitman was nothing like I'd expected. He was probably in his 70s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested he'd built his empire through hard work rather than inherited wealth. When I told him I was Michael Carter's daughter, his eyes actually filled with tears. "Your father," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the most honest man I ever knew. He saved my company, and probably my life. I sat forward, desperate to understand. Victoria said he lost money in bad investments with you. Charles looked genuinely confused. Lost money? Hannah, your father could have been a millionaire 30 years ago if he'd wanted to be. We offered him full partnership, stock options, everything. But he turned it all down. Why would he do that? He said money changes people, and he never wanted it to change him. Charles walked me over to a wall covered with old photographs. In one of them, I saw my father, but not the father I knew. This man wore an expensive suit and was shaking hands with a group of businessmen in what looked like a boardroom. This was taken in 1995, Charles explained. Your father was our financial advisor. Best we ever had. He could spot a good investment from a mile away and had an intuitive understanding of the market that made us all rich. I stared at the photo, trying to reconcile this successful businessman with the janitor who raised me. If he was so good at making money, why did he leave? Charles handed me another photo, this one of Dad holding me as a baby. I couldn't have been more than 6 months old. He said he'd rather be rich in time with his daughter than rich in money without her. So he quit, took the janitor job for the steady hours and benefits, and invested his savings carefully. He lived like he was poor so he could be there for you. The magnitude of my father's sacrifice hit me like a physical blow. He'd given up millions to be a present father, working nights so he could be available during my childhood days. And all these years, I'd thought we were struggling. He talked about you constantly, Charles continued. Said you were his greatest investment, worth more than all the money in the world. I left Charles's office with tears in my eyes and a new understanding of who my father really was. That evening, I returned to my apartment with a heart full of new grief and pride. Dad hadn't been poor, he'd been protecting me from the corruption he believed money could bring. He'd lived modestly not because he had to, but because he chose to. I was still processing everything I'd learned when I noticed something wrong. My apartment door was slightly ajar, and I always locked it when I left. Heart pounding, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, cushions were overturned, and papers were scattered everywhere. But I knew immediately what was missing. The lockbox was gone. I called the police, but they said without signs of forced entry, it would be hard to prove anything. As I cleaned up the mess, my phone rang. Hannah? It's Victoria. I heard about the break-in. How terrible. Did they take anything valuable? The concern in her voice sounded as fake as her sympathy at the lawyer's office. Just some personal items from my father. Oh, you mean that old box you found? Such a shame. I hope it wasn't anything too important. I hadn't told anyone about the box except the locksmith shops I'd called. The only way Victoria could know about it was if she'd taken it herself. If you're listening to this story and finding yourself on the edge of your seat, let me know in the comments what you think Victoria is really up to. And don't forget to hit that like button if you want to see how this family betrayal unfolds, because what happens next will blow your mind. I knew confronting Victoria directly was risky, but I was done playing games. The next morning, I drove to the mansion where she lived, Dad's house. I realized with a fresh wave of anger. He'd bought this place and never told me, while I struggled to pay rent on my tiny apartment. Victoria answered the door in a silk robe, looking annoyed at being disturbed so early. Hannah, sweetie, what brings you by so early? You know exactly why I'm here, I said, pushing past her into the foyer. You stole from me. Victoria's eyes narrowed, but she maintained her innocent act. I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you feeling all right? Grief can make people paranoid, you know. I scanned the living room desperately, looking for any sign of the green lockbox. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, like she'd hired a decorator to make the house look wealthy rather than lived in. Maybe you just misplaced it, Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false concern. Stress does terrible things to the memory. That's when I spotted it, a flash of forest green partially hidden under a stack of magazines on the coffee table. The lockbox. My father's lockbox that she'd stolen from my apartment. I lunged toward it, but before I could reach it, footsteps echoed from the hallway. A tall young man emerged, probably in his late 20s, with Victoria's same cold eyes and calculating expression. Mom said you might come sniffing around, he said with a sneer. I'm Derek, by the way. Victoria's son. Derek was everything I'd expected from Victoria's offspring, entitled, smug, and radiating the kind of arrogance that comes from never having worked for anything. He positioned himself between me and the coffee table, crossing his arms over his expensive polo shirt. You must be the gold-digging stepdaughter we've heard so much about, he said. Gold-digging? I almost laughed. I didn't even know there was gold to dig for until 3 days ago. Victoria moved to stand beside her son, and suddenly the dynamic became clear. This wasn't just me against her, it was me against both of them, and they'd been planning this together. Here's the thing, Hannah, Victoria said, dropping her fake sweet tone entirely. Your father's character test is designed to see if you're obsessed with money. And breaking into my house, accusing me of theft, desperately searching for some mysterious box, well, that doesn't exactly scream integrity over money, does it? My blood ran cold as I realized what she was doing. Every move I made to find the truth could be twisted to make me look greedy and money-obsessed. You're trying to make me fail the test, I said. Derek laughed. We don't have to make you do anything. You're doing it all by yourself. Mom, should we call Mr. Peterson and tell him about Hannah's erratic behavior? I looked between them, understanding for the first time how thoroughly I'd been outmaneuvered. They weren't just trying to steal my inheritance, they were systematically destroying my character in the process. Get out of my house, Victoria said, her mask comp. Or that possibility. I also realized that stealing it back would only prove their point about my character. Walking away from that house was one of the hardest things I ever did, knowing that the key to my father's message was sitting right there, and I couldn't touch it. I drove around aimlessly for an hour, trying to figure out my next move. Victoria had played this perfectly, she'd stolen something crucial from me, but if I tried to get it back, I'd look like exactly the kind of person who valued money over integrity. Maybe that was the real test. Maybe Dad knew Victoria would try something like this, and he wanted to see if I'd maintain my moral compass even when everything was on the line. But what did that mean I should do? Give up and let her win? There had to be another way to prove my character while still fighting for what was rightfully mine. I called my best friend Sophie Bennett, the only person I trusted completely. Sophie had been my roommate in college and knew me better than anyone. If anyone could help me think through this impossible situation, it would be her. Sophie, I said when she answered, I need help. And it's going to sound completely crazy. Sophie met me at our usual coffee shop, and I told her everything, the inheritance, the character test, Victoria's manipulation, and the stolen lockbox. To her credit, Sophie listened without interrupting, even when the story got completely unbelievable. So let me get this straight, she said when I finished. Your janitor dad was secretly a millionaire, his new wife is trying to steal your inheritance by making you look bad, and the key to proving your worthiness is locked in a box she stole from you? I know it sounds insane. It sounds like a soap opera, Sophie said. But I know you, Hannah. You're the most honest person I've ever met. If your dad wanted someone with integrity to inherit his money, he couldn't have picked better. That's when Sophie said something that changed everything. Remember what your dad wrote in that note? Find the key to who I was. Maybe the key isn't in that box. Maybe it's a person. I thought about what Charles Whitman had told me, about Dad choosing time with me over money. Then I remembered someone else Dad used to talk about all the time, his mentor from when he first started at the school. Mr. Wilson, I said suddenly. Dad's old supervisor. He retired a few years ago, but they stayed in touch. Sophie grinned. Now you're thinking like your father's daughter instead of reacting like Victoria wants you to. That afternoon, I drove to the modest apartment complex where Mr. Wilson lived, hoping he might have answers that didn't require stealing anything from anyone. Mr. Wilson was exactly as I remembered him, a kind man in his 70s with gentle eyes and hands weathered by decades of honest work. He invited me in for tea and seemed genuinely happy to see me. Your father talked about you every single day, he said as we sat in his small living room. He was so proud of the woman you became. Mr. Wilson, did you know about Dad's money? He nodded slowly. Michael trusted me with a lot of secrets over the years. He was terrified that wealth would change you the way he'd seen it change other people. Then why leave it to me at all? Mr. Wilson smiled. Because he also believed that if anyone could handle money without losing their soul, it would be you. But he wanted to make sure you understood what real wealth was first. I don't understand. Mr. Wilson got up and pulled a photo album from his bookshelf. Your father didn't just clean that school, Hannah. He used his money to help people. Anonymous scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college. Medical bills paid for teachers who were struggling. Groceries delivered to families in need. He showed me page after page of photos, graduation ceremonies, thank you letters, families whose lives had been changed by my father's secret generosity. He called it his real investment portfolio, Mr. Wilson explained. He was growing something better than money, he was growing hope. Looking at those photos, I finally understood what my father's character test was really about. Armed with this new understanding of my father's legacy, I felt ready to face whatever Victoria threw at me next. But I wasn't prepared for what happened when I got home. A certified letter was waiting for me, and my stomach dropped when I saw it was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a petition filed in court, requesting that I be declared financially irresponsible and unfit to inherit. The petition was signed by Victoria and included a thick stack of supporting documents. As I flipped through them, I felt like I might be sick. Credit card statements showing thousands of dollars in luxury purchases. Bank records indicating reckless spending. Bills from expensive stores I'd never even visited. All in my name. All with my signature. Except I'd never made any of these purchases, and that wasn't my signature on the receipts. Victoria had forged evidence to make me look exactly like the kind of person my father wouldn't want to inherit his money. And if the probate judge believed these documents when evaluating my character in 3 weeks, I wouldn't just fail Dad's test, I'd be legally prohibited from inheriting anything. I called Mr. Peterson immediately, but he delivered more bad news. Hannah, Judge Morrison will review all evidence of your conduct during the 60-day probate period. If these documents are authentic, it will be very difficult to argue that you demonstrated the integrity your father required. They're not authentic, I said desperately. She's framing me. Then you need to prove that. And you need to do it quickly. I spent the next day trying to figure out how to prove the documents were forged. The credit card company confirmed that someone had indeed made those purchases using a card in my name, but they couldn't tell me who had physically used it without a police investigation that would take weeks. The signatures looked disturbingly close to mine. Whoever had forged them had practiced. But the addresses on the bills were wrong, and some of the purchases had been made while I was at work, with coworkers who could verify my whereabouts. Then I remembered Derek. He'd seemed awfully confident about their plan, and young men weren't always as careful as they thought they were. I decided to set a trap. I called Derek and asked if we could meet for coffee. I know your mom and I got off on the wrong foot, I said, making my voice sound defeated. Maybe we can work something out before the judge makes his decision. Derek agreed, probably thinking I was ready to give up. We met at a Starbucks near his mother's house, and I made sure to sit at a table far from other customers. I don't want to fight this anymore, I lied. The legal fees alone are going to bankrupt me. Maybe we can come to some kind of arrangement. Derek's arrogance made him careless. Within minutes, he was bragging about how smart their plan was. Once the judge rules Mom gets all that money, she can buy me whatever I want, he said, stirring his latte. New car, maybe a condo in Miami. Your dad's money is going to set us up for life. I kept Derek talking, acting like I was resigned to losing while secretly recording everything on my phone. The more he bragged, the more details he revealed about their scheme. The credit card thing was genius, he said. Mom said it would be worth the risk, and she was right. Who's going to believe you didn't make those purchases when we have receipts with your signature? How did you get my signature so perfect? I asked, hoping I sounded impressed rather than horrified. Derek pulled out his phone and showed me photos of checks I'd written to my father over the years, birthday gifts, Father's Day cards, small amounts to help with what I thought were his expenses. Mom started collecting your handwriting samples the day she married your dad, he said proudly. She went through all his papers, found every letter and card you ever sent him. She's been planning this for months. I felt sick realizing how long Victoria had been setting me up. She'd married my father with this plan already in motion, systematically gathering everything she'd need to destroy me. What about the purchases themselves? I pressed. How did you actually buy all that stuff? Derek's smirk grew wider. Easy. I used a fake ID with your name on it. Mom has connections, you'd be amazed what money can buy. By the time Derek left, I had everything I needed to expose their fraud. But I also realized that Victoria's plan went deeper than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about greed, it was about destroying me completely. I rushed the recording to my lawyer, Mr. Peterson, who listened with growing amazement and concern. This is excellent evidence, he said. Derek basically confessed to identity theft and fraud. But we need official documentation to make it admissible in court. I'll file for emergency subpoenas of the credit card transactions and store security footage. What else can I do? We need to trace those fake purchases back to Derek through official channels. If we can prove he physically made them using false identification, Judge Morrison will have to throw out their entire case. But even as we were planning our defense, Victoria struck again. Mr. Peterson called me that evening with news that made my stomach drop. Hannah, Victoria's lawyer, just filed an emergency motion. They're claiming your father changed his will shortly before his death, leaving everything to Victoria directly. That's impossible. You have the real will. They're producing what they claim is a more recent will, signed just 2 weeks before your father's death. Apparently Victoria took your father to see her friend, some lawyer named Patterson who practices estate law. If it's authentic, it supersedes everything we discussed. I felt like the walls were closing in. Every time I found a way to fight back, Victoria had another move ready. She wasn't just trying to win my father's money, she was systematically destroying every avenue I had to prove my case. Can they really do this? I asked. If the will is genuine, yes. We'll need a handwriting expert to analyze it, but that takes time we don't have. Judge Morrison reviews everything in 2 days. Sophie came over that night and found me sitting on my kitchen floor, surrounded by all the documents from my father's estate, trying to find something, anything, that could help me fight Victoria's latest attack. This isn't fair, Sophie said, sitting down beside me. Your dad never would have changed his will to cut you out completely. I picked up the copy of the new will that Victoria's lawyer had provided. Something about it bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "Sophie, look at this signature," I said, pointing to the bottom of the document. "Does it look right to you?" Sophie had seen my father's handwriting many times over the years. He'd written me letters when I was in college, and she'd helped me read his sometimes difficult script. "It looks like his writing, but..." She paused, studying it more carefully. "It's too neat. Your dad's handwriting got shakier as he got older, especially after his arthritis got bad. This looks like someone was trying too hard to make it perfect." That's when I realized what was bothering me. In the last year of his life, Dad's handwriting had become noticeably less precise. His hands hurt, and he often complained about how hard it was to grip a pen properly. But this signature was flawless, too flawless for a man with arthritis to have written just weeks before his death. "We need a handwriting expert," I said. "And we need one fast." Sophie grinned. "Lucky for you, my cousin works for an insurance company investigating document fraud. Let me make a call." Sophie's cousin agreed to do an emergency analysis, comparing the new will with samples of my father's authentic handwriting from various periods of his life. What she found confirmed our suspicions. "This signature was definitely forged," she explained. "Whoever did it was skilled, but they were working from older samples of your father's writing. They didn't account for the deterioration in his fine motor control that would have affected his penmanship in recent years." Armed with this evidence, I felt hopeful for the first time in days. But I still needed to understand how Victoria had managed to keep my father's wealth hidden from me for so long. Something Mr. Wilson had mentioned stuck with me. I called him that evening. "Mr. Wilson, how did my dad manage his investments without me ever seeing any paperwork?" "Oh, that's easy," he said. "Michael was paranoid about you finding out, so he rented a P.O. box downtown about 15 years ago. Used it for all his financial mail, bank statements, stock reports, everything. Had a private accountant named Ms. Chen who handled all the paperwork. Said he wanted to keep his two lives completely separate. That explained everything. Dad had created an entire financial identity that existed parallel to our daily life, using a P.O. box and private accountant to ensure I never accidentally discovered his wealth. The subpoenas Mr. Peterson had filed were starting to pay off too. Store security footage clearly showed Derek making purchases with fake identification, and bank records proved the credit cards were opened using forged applications. But I still felt like I was missing one crucial piece of evidence, something that would definitively prove my father's true wishes. That night, Sophie and I made a desperate decision. We needed to find that lockbox, and we had a strong suspicion Victoria still had it hidden somewhere in the mansion. We parked down the street and waited until all the lights in the house went out. Then, using skills I never thought I'd need, we snuck around to the back patio where French doors led into the living room. The doors were unlocked. Victoria's arrogance had made her careless. We slipped inside, using our phone flashlights to navigate through the dark house. I found Victoria's home office and began searching systematically. Sophie kept watch by the door, ready to warn me if anyone came. That's when I spotted it, the green lockbox sitting on a shelf behind Victoria's desk. To my amazement, it was no longer locked. Victoria must have forced it open to see what was inside. I carefully removed the contents, dozens of receipts showing my father's anonymous charitable donations, letters of thanks from scholarship recipients, and most importantly, a sealed envelope marked, "For Hannah's eyes only, to be opened if my character is ever questioned." Sophie quickly photographed everything while I read my father's final letter. His words brought tears to my eyes and gave me exactly the ammunition I needed for tomorrow's hearing. But then we heard footsteps coming down the hallway. Derek appeared in the doorway, clearly not expecting to find us there. But instead of fighting, I simply held up my phone showing Sophie's photos. "We already have everything we need," I said calmly. And unlike your forged evidence, this was all legally photographed and will be subpoenaed through proper channels. Derek's confidence crumbled as he realized we'd outmaneuvered him. The next morning, I walked into Judge Morrison's chambers with Mr. Peterson, carrying a folder full of legitimate evidence that would expose Victoria's fraud completely. Sophie sat in the gallery behind me, offering moral support as I prepared to fight for my father's legacy. When Victoria's lawyer presented their forged will, Mr. Peterson systematically destroyed every piece of their case. The handwriting analysis proved the will was fake. The subpoenaed security footage showed Derek making fraudulent purchases. The bank records demonstrated a pattern of identity theft. But the most powerful evidence was my father's final letter, which I read aloud to Judge Morrison. If Hannah is reading this, it means someone has questioned her character and tried to prevent her from inheriting my estate. I want the court to know that my daughter is the most honest, compassionate person I've ever known. She values truth over convenience, integrity over wealth, and justice over personal gain. She has more than passed any character test I could devise. Judge Morrison ruled in my favor on every count. Victoria and Derek were arrested on the courthouse steps, and as Victoria was being handcuffed, she tried to maintain her dignity but tripped over her expensive heels and fell face first into a puddle from the morning rain. The photographers got every humiliating second. Derek tried to approach me one last time as they led him away. "Hannah, please, you know I was just following my mother's orders. Can't you find it in your heart to?" I turned my back on him and walked away without a word. As I left the courthouse, I thought about the scholarship fund I would establish, the families I could help, and the legacy of quiet kindness my father had built. I wasn't just inheriting his money, I was inheriting his mission to make the world a little better, one act of generosity at a time. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "You were never just a janitor, Dad. You were a millionaire in every way that mattered." And if you followed this incredible journey to the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew was living a completely different life? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories about justice, family secrets, and the power of doing what's right. Sometimes the people who seem to have the least are actually the richest of all.